I thought I was just fixing a forgotten garden, but when my stepfather's hand brushed mine, and he whispered, "She loved roses too," I realized he wasn't just keeping her memory alive, he was reaching for me. The first time I stepped back into the garden after she was gone, it felt like I had walked into a place that no longer knew me. Weeds had swallowed the edges of the stone path, curling over each other in thick tangles. The once proud rose bushes leaned weakly, their branches brittle and gray, with only a few stubborn buds clinging on. It didn't smell like her anymore. I used to remember stepping outside and being wrapped in that faint perfume of roses and soil. Now, all I could smell was damp earth and neglect. I stood there for a long while, gripping the handle of the rusted shears, not knowing where to begin. Every corner of the garden reminded me of her hands, how carefully she had coaxed beauty from the soil, how much patience she had for every bloom. I was only 23, and suddenly the responsibility of keeping it alive seemed heavier than anything I had carried before. That was when I heard the sound of boots on gravel. My stepfather's voice, low, steady, came from behind me. "You're out here early." I turned, and there he was, tall, broad-shouldered, his shirt sleeves already rolled up like he knew he'd be working before I did. He looked around the garden with a quiet sigh. She loved roses too much to let them go like this. The way he said it made my chest tighten. His words carried both strength and sorrow, as though speaking them aloud was the only way he could keep her presence close. For a moment, I didn't reply. I just studied him, how the lines around his mouth deepened when he spoke, how he stood with his hands in his pockets, as if restraining himself from doing too much, too soon. When he stepped closer, the air shifted. His presence wasn't heavy, it was grounding. Like a stillness that reminded me I wasn't alone. He glanced at the shears in my hand and, with a small, patient smile, said, "Come on. Let's start with the dead branches." She always said the roses bloom better once you make space for them. Something in me softened then. The garden wasn't just mine to save. It was ours. And though we didn't speak of it directly, I could feel it, behind every thorn and every wilted stem, there was a shared grief that bound us quietly together. His offer wasn't just about gardening. It was about not letting her memory fade, and maybe, not letting me fade either. The first few cuts were awkward. I clipped away at the brittle branches with hesitant motions, as though the roses themselves might protest my inexperience. My stepfather crouched nearby, moving with a calm confidence that I envied. He didn't rush, didn't force anything, just steady hands guiding the shears through the dead stems with precision. "Not too close to the green," he murmured, his voice quiet enough that I almost mistook it for a thought spoken aloud. I tried to mimic him, but the stem resisted me, and my hand slipped clumsily. Before I could adjust, his hand was there, warm, steady, closing gently over mine. He didn't take the tool from me, instead, he shifted my grip, his thumb brushing lightly against the inside of my wrist as he guided the angle of the blades. "Like this," he said, the words simple, but the tone carried patience. I nodded, though I wasn't sure he saw it. What I noticed instead was how close he had leaned. The scent of soil clung to his shirt, mixed with something faintly clean, soap or maybe cedar. It caught me off guard, how grounding that small detail felt. When he pulled his hand away, the warmth of his touch lingered longer than it should have, leaving a strange ache behind. We worked quietly after that, side by side. The rhythm of pulling weeds, clipping branches, and piling scraps into a bucket became almost soothing. At times, our elbows brushed, or our shoulders touched when we both reached for the same stubborn stem. Each contact was brief, accidental on the surface, yet it stayed with me, marking the moment as surely as the cuts we left on the rosebushes. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was full. Full of unspoken thoughts, of breaths that seemed to slow and sink, of grief shared without needing to name it. I kept glancing sideways, watching the way his jaw tightened when he focused, or the faint crease in his brow when he found a branch that refused to give way. There was strength in his presence, but also something softer, something I couldn't quite put words to. As the sun climbed higher, the garden began to shift. Patches of cleared soil appeared where chaos had been. It wasn't beautiful yet, but it was beginning to breathe again. I felt it too, like space was being made inside me, a little lighter, a little less tangled. And though we hadn't spoken much, I realized that working beside him was easier than I ever expected. Almost natural. Almost necessary. By midday, the garden was littered with small piles of thorns and wilted stems. My hands ached from pruning, but the ache wasn't unpleasant, it felt earned, like the garden was slowly surrendering its weight back to us. I straightened my back, wiping sweat from my brow, when I caught my stepfather staring at one of the bushes we hadn't yet touched. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on a single fragile bloom clinging to the end of a thin branch. Its petals were pale and bruised, yet stubbornly alive. Finally, he said softly, "She used to sit right here, in the afternoons. Said the roses made her feel less lonely." The words hung between us, fragile as the flower itself. I felt something in my chest crack open at the way he said it, not as a casual memory, but as if speaking it aloud hurt and healed him in the same breath. He crouched down, brushing his fingers lightly over the stem, careful not to touch the thorns. I watched him, struck by the gentleness in his movements. This wasn't just about plants. It was about her. About the love he had carried, and maybe still carried, quietly, like roots buried deep beneath the soil. "She told me once," he continued, almost to himself, "roses don't bloom because we force them. They bloom because we make room for them." His voice caught on the last word, and he paused, pressing his lips together as though trying to steady himself. For a moment, I couldn't find anything to say. My throat felt tight, like the air had thickened between us. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that the garden felt empty without her, that I missed her laugh, her patience, the way she always believed we could grow into something better. But the words stayed trapped inside me. Instead, I stepped closer. Not too close, but close enough that I could see the faint glimmer of moisture in his eyes before he blinked it away. Our shoulders nearly brushed, and I reached out to touch one of the branches, careful to mirror his gentleness. In that small silence, I realized we were both holding the same thing, the garden, yes, but also the ache of loving someone who had left too soon. And maybe, just maybe, we were holding each other up too, in ways neither of us could yet name. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low enough that the shadows of the roses stretched across the garden beds, long and reaching. I set the shears down for a moment, flexing my sore fingers, and glanced at him. He was bent over a cluster of stubborn weeds, the muscles in his forearms taut as he tugged them free. For an instant, I felt that same pull I had earlier, the quiet steadiness of him, the ease in which he seemed to belong here beside me. But just as quickly, the thought unsettled me. I wasn't supposed to notice him this way. He was older, steadier, carrying responsibilities I hadn't even begun to shoulder. He was also my stepfather. That truth landed heavily in my chest, as though reminding me to draw a line that I wasn't sure I trusted myself to keep. I took a few steps back, pretending to study the roses from a different angle. My hands busied themselves with picking at loose soil, though I wasn't doing anything useful. The space between us suddenly felt too charged, and I wasn't sure if it was him I was trying to put distance from, or myself. When I looked up, I caught him watching me. His gaze lingered for a fraction longer than it should have, then dropped quickly back to the ground. His movements shifted after that, more deliberate, less open. He kept his attention fixed on the soil, his voice quieter when he spoke, as if he sensed the boundary I was trying to rebuild. The air seemed to cool with the evening, brushing over the back of my neck. I shivered, though I wasn't cold. Something else gnawed at me, the strange ache of wanting closeness but being afraid of what it might mean. Afraid of being seen in a way I couldn't yet explain. The scrape of metal against stone broke the silence as he gathered the tools into a neat pile. "We've done enough for today," he said, without looking directly at me. The words were simple, but I felt the weight behind them, an attempt at steadiness, at keeping us on safe ground. I nodded, forcing a smile, though my chest felt heavy. The garden around us was quieter now, the stillness of dusk settling in. The absence of his hand on mine, of his shoulder brushing against me, felt louder than all the hours of silence we had shared before. It left me standing there with a hollow kind of longing, as if I had stepped away from something fragile before it could bloom. It happened quickly, one of those sudden spring storms that seem to rise out of nowhere. The sky dimmed, the air thickened, and then the first drop spattered against the rose leaves. At first, I thought it might pass with just a drizzle, but within moments the rain was falling hard, pelting the soil, drumming on the wooden fence with a fierce rhythm. "Come on," he called, already gathering the tools in his arms. His voice was calm, but there was urgency in the way he moved. I scrambled to grab what I could, my shoes slipping slightly on the wet grass, before we dashed together beneath the narrow roof of the porch. The storm closed around us like a curtain. Rain hammered on the tin gutters, the garden fading into a blur of gray and green. My shirt clung damp to my back, and droplets trickled from my hair down the side of my face. I was shivering before I realized it, though part of me wondered if it was really the chill. He set the tools down and leaned against the wooden beam, his breathing steady despite the run. Our shoulders brushed as we squeezed into the dry patch together. At first, I thought he might shift away, give me space. But he didn't. He stayed, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him, countering the cool damp that clung to me. He let out a soft laugh, low and almost wistful. "She used to plant roses knowing storms would come," he said. His eyes were on the garden, though his tone was far away. "She'd say, if they can survive this, they'll bloom stronger." Something in me tightened at those words. I turned to study him in the dim light, the rain glossing the edges of his hair, the drops still clinging to his jaw. There was a quiet weight in him I had never fully noticed before, as if he carried not only the memory of her but also the responsibility of keeping it alive. I wanted to say something then. To tell him that I understood, that I felt it too, the loneliness, the burden of trying to keep her memory alive in every detail. But the words caught in my throat, tangled with everything else I wasn't ready to admit. So I stayed silent, shoulder pressed to his, listening to the storm. And in that closeness, I realized I didn't mind the rain anymore. It was almost as if the world outside could rage and pour, but here, under the porch, there was a stillness I didn't want to leave. The rain didn't stop quickly. It slowed, then surged again, until the sound of it became part of the silence between us. The porch light flickered on automatically as the evening deepened, casting a golden glow that softened the edges of everything, the wooden posts, the streaks of water on the windows, the line of his jaw as he turned slightly toward me. He exhaled, long and quiet, like he had been holding something back all day. "You know," he began, his voice lower than before, "I used to avoid this garden after she passed. Couldn't stand the sight of it. It felt like, if I came out here, I'd see her again, and when she wasn't there," his words trailed off, but the silence that followed carried more than the sentence itself. I swallowed hard, the ache in my chest tightening. I thought I was the only one who felt that way, I admitted. I kept telling myself I'd fix it, but every time I came out here, it just hurt too much. My voice cracked slightly at the end, and I hated how raw it sounded, but there was no taking it back. He turned to me then, fully this time, his eyes searching mine with a gentleness I wasn't ready for. "Working on it with you," he paused, his throat shifting as he swallowed. "It's made it bearable. Not easier, but possible." The word struck me in a place I didn't know I'd been guarding. My breath caught, and before I could think better of it, I confessed, "I don't want you to drift out of my life. Not now. Not ever." The moment the words left me, my heart thudded painfully. I wasn't sure if I'd gone too far, if he'd hear the layers I couldn't yet name. For a long second, he didn't answer. His gaze held mine, steady, unflinching, and the rain's rhythm seemed to slow around us. Then, with a quiet deliberation, he lifted a hand and rested it on my shoulder. His palm was rough from work, but the weight of it was steady, grounding. He didn't squeeze, didn't pull me closer, he just left it there, warm and certain. I felt my breath hitch. That single touch carried more than comfort. It carried acknowledgement, and maybe a question neither of us dared to voice. The porch light cast a soft glow over us, and in that still moment, every unspoken word filled the space between his hand and my racing heartbeat. The weeks that followed carried a rhythm neither of us spoke aloud but both of us kept. Every evening after work, he'd meet me in the garden, sleeves rolled up, boots sinking slightly into the soil as he stepped across the beds. By then, the worst of the weeds had been cleared, and the roses, once weak and skeletal, had begun to find their strength again. New buds swelled against the thorns, small promises waiting to open. On one quiet morning, I walked outside to find him already there. He was crouched by the farthest bush, his hand steady on the stem as he examined a tight pink bud just beginning to unfurl. When he looked up and saw me, his expression softened in a way that made my chest feel lighter, though he said nothing at first. I joined him, kneeling in the damp grass, my shoulder brushing his as we both leaned in to study the bloom. The air was sweet with the faint perfume of roses waking after their long silence, and I realized I could breathe more easily here than I had in months. It wasn't just the garden that was changing, it was me, and maybe it was him too. "You did this," I said quietly, though my eyes stayed on the flower. His head shook, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "We did this." His voice was steady, but the way he lingered on the word we carried a weight I felt deep inside me. We stood after that, side by side, looking over what had once been ruin and now showed the first signs of life. Our hands brushed as we shifted, a fleeting touch, but neither of us pulled away. Instead, my fingers stayed close, grazing his just enough to feel the warmth, the quiet intention in the space between us. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to step back. The hesitation that had haunted me earlier seemed to ease in the morning light. I understood then that what we were building wasn't reckless, it was careful, slow, rooted like the roses themselves. He glanced at me once more, and our eyes held. No grand declarations, no dramatic gestures. Just a small, shared smile and the simple truth that we weren't facing this alone. The garden smelled alive again, roses unfurling into the sun, and as I stood beside him, I couldn't help but think that maybe this was what she would have wanted all along, the roses blooming, and us, still here, still together, finding our way forward.